Do you really think that would be a sufficient plan to deter a Chinese invasion if it includes long-range missiles, ground troops, an aerial blockade, a naval blockade?
Caitlin,
all of the different measures here?
Caitlin.
Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy had a contentious interview with CNN's Caitlin Collins over his suggestion that arming the people of Taiwan with firearms could potentially help them defend themselves against an invasion by China.
Strap in, folks, because we've got yet another textbook case of the legacy media doing what they do best: distort, spin, and selectively outrage. This time it was CNN's Caitlin Collins taking aim at Vivek Ramaswamy over a single, out-of-context remark about arming Taiwanese citizens. But instead of letting that narrative fly unchallenged, Anna Kasparian stepped in and dismantled the hit job with surgical precision. She exposed how the media latched onto a throwaway line, twisted it into a headline, and ignored the broader policy entirely. Whether you're aligned with Ramaswamy's worldview or not, the real issue isn't about one foreign policy soundbite. It's about the media's obsession with cheap gotcha tactics that only strengthen the appeal of outsider candidates. And yes, they even tried labeling it as mansplaining. You can't make this stuff.
Much more of that conversation, how it went down, and then we'll talk about the reality.
Caitlin, of course it's not sufficient. You take that tiny little clip when I've articulated at the Nixon Library last week, a 1-hour speech with a whole range of deterrents. That is part of it. But I've also said that I would pull Russia out of its military alliance with China. I've also said that we would bolster our partnership with India to be able to close the Andaman Sea and the Malacca Strait. I've also said that we would actually send a signal very clearly that we will defend Taiwan, moving from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity to say that we will defend Taiwan until we have semiconductor independence in this country. And so, yes, part of this is turning Taiwan into a porcupine. I think exporting our Second Amendment is a relatively free or low-cost way to do that. But I find it laughable that you will take that clip and then put words into my mouth as though that was a sufficient deterrent. Caitlin, with due respect, that's a joke. I will not allow someone to put words in my mouth to say that I ever said that was sufficient. It is not.
I'm not putting words in your mouth. I'm simply asking about something you said. We played a quote that you've made. Speaking of another comment that you've made. I never said it was sufficient.
So I went into his full speech at the Nixon Library, and he's actually telling the truth, hyper-focusing on what to me was more of like a throwaway statement or something to kind of like attract potentially campaign donations from the NRA. It's just it's not really a good representation of something more comprehensive that he shared during that speech about his foreign policy. You might disagree with his foreign policy, and honestly, I think that what he actually said during his speech, some parts of it were incredibly naive, and we can get into that. But I want to provide the receipts and show you what he actually said during that speech. Before I do, briefly, Cenk, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was set to disagree with him because I think he put that part in the speech, both to appeal to the base and to get the media to talk about it because it's so outrageously stupid, in my opinion. But once I watched the speech and the interview, I think that he is right about the core of what he's saying, which is he didn't say sufficient. And saying sufficient changes the entire tenor of what he was saying.
So let's get into what he actually said during his speech. I think it's actually interesting, maybe a discussion about foreign policy and whether or not.
Flashpoint for all this media outrage: Ramaswamy's suggestion that every household in Taiwan should be armed and trained to defend against a possible Chinese invasion. Sure, it plays well to certain voters who value the Second Amendment and individual responsibility, but it quickly became a media lightning rod. CNN's Caitlin Collins pounced, framing the idea as naive in the face of China's overwhelming military firepower, missiles, blockades, the whole package. But Ramaswamy pushed back hard, pointing out that this idea was a small part of a much larger strategic vision, not the standalone policy CNN made it out to be. Speaking recently at the Nixon Library, he directly accused the media of cherry-picking his most provocative comments to distort the substance of his proposals.
During that speech, again, it was last week at the Nixon Library, he said that one of the first things he wanted to do was end the war in Ukraine. He says that he refuses to use the resources of the United States on the Russian invasion in Ukraine when we should be using our resources on the invasion on our southern border. So right off the bat, obviously, I disagree with his framing there entirely. But nonetheless, he also would stop arming Ukraine, which would force Ukraine to give up territory like the Donbas region, and essentially agree to like some sort of peace agreement with Putin. And then he would agree to do something else that he claims Russia wants. So let's take a look at that.
The Russia-China alliance represents the single greatest military threat that we face in the U.S. today. I will end the Ukraine war on terms that require Vladimir Putin to exit his military alliance with China. The deal I will do with Vladimir Putin is simple. We will freeze the current lines of control. We will further make a hard commitment that NATO will never admit Ukraine to NATO. I will require that Russia exit its military alliance with China. I will require that Russia remove its nuclear weapons from Kaliningrad, the strip of Russia that borders Poland. And I will require, pursuant to my modern Monroe Doctrine, that Russia remove its military presence in the Western Hemisphere, not in Cuba, not in Venezuela, not in Nicaragua. You're out. And in return, we will reopen economic relations with Russia, just as Nixon did with China.
Now, cutting off Russia economically with economic sanctions has not been persuasive to Putin. Keep that in mind. I think that it's naive to think that if we make a commitment to preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, that Putin would agree to like end his alliance with China. That's the area where I think Vivek Ramaswamy is being incredibly naive. But he does think that if he succeeds in that, in basically having Russia end its alliance with China, that would have an impact on China's foreign policy in Taiwan.
Dig a little deeper into Ramaswamy's foreign policy, and it's clear there's far more nuance than the mainstream coverage implies. A major pillar of his plan is cutting off U.S. military aid to Ukraine, which he sees as a costly distraction from domestic priorities. He advocates for freezing the conflict where it stands, compelling Ukraine to cede disputed areas like Donbas and blocking its NATO membership altogether. In his view, securing America's southern border takes precedence over foreign entanglements. He also lays out an aggressive blueprint to fracture the Russia-China alliance by dangling economic incentives and demanding major concessions, like pulling Russian forces out of Venezuela, Cuba, and other strategic zones. The goal: undermine China's influence without firing a shot. But while ambitious, critics argue it's overly simplistic to think diplomatic carrots alone can untangle complex global alliances.
Very curious what you think about his foreign policy so far. Before I go to you though, clearly he's talking about a lot more than just arming the people of Taiwan, right? So relevant to the conversation with Caitlin Collins. Jen, what do you think?
So first I'm gonna tell you three things that I think Vivek's wrong about, and then three things that the media is wrong about in covering him. So in terms of the foreign policy speech, there's three layers to it. First one is a fairly standard Republican talking points now about freezing the action where it is now, basically giving Donbas to the Russians and stopping all aid to Ukraine. I don't agree with it at all, but it's not crazy. I mean, it is crazy in my opinion, but it's not crazy to Republicans. It's perfectly normal within Republican circles. Then he gets into these fun ideas about, oh, we're going to get Russia to withdraw from Cuba and Venezuela, etc., and we're going to get them out of the area next to Poland, and we're going to do this grand deal with China. Totally, utterly unrealistic. Not how diplomacy works.
You don't think that'll be enticing to Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, I'm sure he's this close to it. Besides which, the whole thing's based on a fantasy that we're going to get into a military conflict with Russia and China, that they're going to gang up on us. They're not going to start a giant war against us. We're not worried about it. We're worried about, hey, are we going to have regional conflicts that start to spiral out of control, like Taiwan, Ukraine, etc.? But he makes it sound like as if they're going to attack us all at once. China sells to us more than they sell to anyone. They would ruin their own economy if they got into a significant conflict with America. So look, I don't think any of that makes any sense. I think it's a little childish, but that's a disagreement. Republicans have to go radical these days. If you just do a normal, logical diplomatic solution offer, the Republican base will hate it. right? So, okay, now, but the third layer is this, let's arm the Taiwanese with AR-15s. Now, that's so over the top and ridiculous that it's meant to draw media attention. It's meant to, it's like he's catfishing. He's like, oh yeah, and then I'm gonna give all the folks in Taiwan AR-15s and hand grenades. Come on, media, anybody out there, anybody out there? And by the way, I respect the hate the game, don't hate the player, right? I respect what he's doing. In fact, the Just Democrats should do it, but with rational things. He's saying, shiny object, come attack. Now, then he's gonna say, hey, I got this thing where we're gonna give up on Ukraine and we're gonna support the Russians and the Republican voters like that, right? So it's a fine strategy in terms of optics and politics. It's terrible on the policy. But what is the media reaction? Instead of bringing it down like we just did. Okay, so Caitlin Collins says, so you think just giving guns to the Taiwanese is sufficient? But he didn't say sufficient.
No.
He laid out a 48-minute speech where that was a small part of the whole thing. And when you frame it that way, in a dishonest way, then it's manna from heaven for him. Because then he gets to be a victim of the media too.
That's exactly right.
Right?
That's exactly right.
So you're feeding right into him. He could, like, if I'm on Vivek's team, I love how that went. Right?
Totally.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Now I'm the hero fighting back against CNN, and I caught him in a lie.
By the way,
right?
And by the way, look, honestly, at this point,
Commentators haven't held back in calling out the media's treatment of Ramaswamy's platform. CNN, among others, is accused of boiling down a multifaceted foreign policy agenda into a single outlandish proposal, arming Taiwanese civilians, and turning it into a sensational headline. HuffPost even escalated things by framing the interview as an example of mansplaining, sidestepping policy debate in favor of identity politics. The result: Ramaswamy is cast as a victim of media bias, which ironically boosts his anti-establishment credentials among voters tired of elite narratives. While commentators acknowledge his strategic ideas show depth, they don't ignore the flaws, like the overly optimistic belief that Putin would ditch China for some economic incentives or that India would jump into high-risk deals for minor trade perks. Yet the real issue remains. Instead of dissecting the policy, the media defaults to spin, which only undercuts their credibility. So whether you agree with Ramaswamy or not, the real takeaway is how the press keeps recycling the same playbook: grab a quote, slap on a headline, and hope no one digs deeper. But thanks to commentators like Anna Kasparian, the truth is getting harder for legacy outlets to bury. If you're tired of being fed half-truths, keep questioning, stay curious, and make sure you're hearing the full story, not just the one the media wants to sell.